Hello, my name is John O Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and obviously the war between Russia and Ukraine is for us just around the corner. We recently had a broadcast from eastern Ukraine by the distinguished war correspondent Tomasz Grzywaczewski. He was so interesting that we wanted to get him into the studio and give us his views on the broader aspects of the conflict. This extended in the end to a session lasting 1.5 hours, which we have broken into two. This is the first of these two interviews. It covers a great deal of ground, and I think you will find that his views on all these topics of the war, the mentality of the combatants, both in Ukraine and in Russia, their neighbors and what the powers around Ukraine and facing Russia think. And so without more ado, I'll turn to Tomasz and invite him to begin. Well, first of all, welcome to our Danube Dialogue podcast. I'm delighted you could make it. And I want to begin by asking you about your recent experiences, which seem to me to be remarkable. You have been traveling around Ukraine, both Western and Eastern, and you have traveled there from Poland, so you know what's happening in Poland as well as what's happening in both halves, so to speak, of Ukraine. So my first question, therefore, is what do you think is going to be, from now on, the course of the war? Can you make any prediction about the course of the war? At the moment, the point from which we start, we're looking now at a Russian army that seems bogged down around Kiev, preparing to encircle and attack it, but at the same time, way behind schedule, and perhaps bleeding men and material at such a rate that it becomes unrealistic to think of it taking Kiev. Perhaps the other army is making ground and progress, so to speak, the other Russian army in the south, and is attempting to deny Ukraine access to the Black Sea and turn it into a Russian lake. Now, that's the situation. Do you have any, at this point, do you have a prediction you'd like to make about the future course of events?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here with you and to discuss this ongoing Russian invasion against Ukraine. And my first impression is that this war has been extremely surprising on very different levels. And first level is that I think no one expected that the Ukrainian army, but also Ukrainian nation, is going to be so determined to protect their homeland. When this full-scale invasion was launched, I was in the front line in Donbass with Ukrainian soldiers close to Donetsk. And right at that night, we didn't sleep because we know that something might happen. So like 15 minutes after we received information that Russia started airstriking and missile striking Kiev, but also Kharkiv airport in Dnipro. And when we realized that this great war is really starting, Ukrainian officer who was taking care of us decided that we need to be evacuated around 20 kilometers from the front line to temporary headquarters of this unit with which we were there. And within next hours, I had this impression that almost all one is quite sure that Russians are going to encircle us there. That the invasion is going very fast, that they will probably try to encircle this part of Donbass, and also were scared that the Russians are attacking from different directions, like Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Chernobyl nuclear power plant, but also from the Crimea Peninsula and trying to capture Mariupol. But in the next days, we learned that in fact, Russian army is not invincible. And I have this impression that we're stuck in this very collective illusion that Russian army is so mighty that it's almost impossible to stop it. that if there is a political decision of invasion, it means that Ukraine is going to be at least partially decimated. And it occurred that Russian army is in a much worse condition than anyone could have expected. And on the other hand, that Ukrainian army is so determined to fight and to stop Russian invaders. And it's not also only the army, but also Ukrainian people. And many places all around the Ukraine, I saw how these self-defense units are created. By self-defense, I understand not even the territorial defense forces, but like people from towns, villages, they're gathering, they are building checkpoints with sandbags and with concrete blocks. They were taking any guns that they can obtain, including like rifle guns or machetes or something, or some even baseball bats, and standing there, being prepared if Russian come to their hometowns or villages. So this scale of resistance is something absolutely amazing.
Yes, now that's the scale of resistance. But first of all, let's look at the Russians for a moment, because this is a very big change from their apparent successes in 2008 when they invaded Georgia, and secondly, 2014 when they annexed the Crimea. Now, on both of those occasions, in different ways, they seem very formidable. In the first instance, they simply had massive superiority in weapons and numbers, and they, in a sense, just rode over the Georgian opposition. I'm not saying there wasn't bravery on the Georgian side, but it was no match for the sheer weight of Russian power. So that would have been worrying for you, of course. The second is that they were unusually and unexpectedly nimble in how they took over Crimea. That was almost a special forces operation and an intelligence operation as much as a war. In fact, it wasn't a war. It didn't become a war despite some fighting. And do we think that somehow or other the Russian strategists felt they had nothing to learn from those successful wars and became complacent, or what?
I suppose that that Russian politicians, they underestimated first that the Ukrainian army has modernized a lot during past it's like 8 years. Near 2014-15, there were mainly these volunteers battalions that were fighting in Donbass. I was also at that time in Donbass, the year 2015, before the so-called Minsk agreement was signed. And of course, there were already regular army forces, but there were also a lot of these volunteers battalions. So Ukrainian army at that time was in a very poor condition in terms of equipment, but also commanding chains. Also, it was infiltrated by Russian intelligence. But I think that the Ukrainian state made a great amount of work to change their army into the real force. And also, Ukrainians get used to this warfare reality. I mean, because the war has been going on since the year 2014. This is the thing that I suppose that we underestimate currently. We are talking, okay, the war has started on February 24th. Actually, it has not. It started in 2014. And when I was in Donbass a few days before this full-scale invasion, I saw their totally decimated villages. I saw trenches. I heard shelling. I saw soldiers fighting there on daily basis. So I think this is the first reason. The second reason is that apparently Kremlin really believed that the inhabitants of at least eastern part of Ukraine are going to welcome Russian forces as liberators. That they say, yeah, we would like to be the part of this so-called Ruski Mir, so the Russian word, and that really Russian forces are going to bring us freedom from this fascist Kiev government. But it occurred that it is, of course, only propaganda, and I suppose that Kremlin was it was like self-illusion, that they created the word of propaganda and fake news, and in fact they really believed in their own lies. And when the Russian forces started invasion, it has occurred that there is a reality check. The reality is that even Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine don't want to be the part of Ruski Mir. So this is also the profound change in comparison to year 2014 and 15, when at least part of inhabitants of Donbass was really supporting separatists backed forces and Russians themselves. Today, they are not. Of course, there might be some individuals that are still working and supporting Russian invasion, but the gross amount of people is just treating these forces as occupants, even in cities like Melitopol, Mariupol, or Kharkiv, that are rather Russian-speaking cities. Because, of course, it was obvious that in Western Ukraine, where this also collective memory of resistance against Russia is extremely strong, and they are like they are absolutely anti-Russian. So, okay, in Western Ukraine, we could expect that. But in Eastern Ukraine, it is something shocking.
Well, let's look at the ideas on both sides here. First of all, you've said the Kremlin, in a sense, pumped its own illusions into itself and thought they were reality. And yet that's something you would expect, and perhaps you can talk here about that famous meeting in which Putin was surrounded by his kitchen cabinet or kitchen war cabinet. But you would expect the intelligence services to come in and present a picture that was more rooted in reality. After all, as you said, there's no doubt that Ukraine must have a lot of Russian intelligence agents in it at various levels of society. So they would have been able to tell them, look, boys, this isn't going to be the walkover you think. There's a slightly different spirit in the air, or would they?
Yeah, this is something that is, I think, right now hard to determine the reasons why really Russian intelligence service, that are claimed to be one of the most effective in the world, hasn't managed to provide Putin and his closest companions about the information about what's really going on in Ukraine. Even though for anyone who has been traveling to Ukraine, it was quite obvious that Ukrainian nation is determined to protect its homeland, and that the experience of war of 2014 and this ongoing war is like identity building experience. Even though, in my opinion, Ukrainian people didn't believe that this full-scale war would really start. I was in Kiev in the weekend before the invasion, and particularly striking for me was the Saturday's evening, because I went out to see how the Ukrainian capital is preparing for the potential invasion. And in fact, there were like hundreds, thousands of people going out to restaurants, to pubs, to clubs. They just enjoying the life. So the normal life of big European city that is just having fun and partying during the weekend. And
let me just intervene here, because I happen to be in Tiflis, in Tbilisi, 2 days after the Russians had moved into Georgia and had stopped about 11 kilometers from the capital. And to my great surprise, I was met at the airport and taken to the part of town which is full of restaurants, and the restaurants and the open-air cafes were absolutely packed with people at 1 a.m, all having a drink, having a meal. I got a very good Georgian meal at about 1 a.m, and I was amazed. And I remember asking my colleague, I was then with Radio Free Europe, how come? And They said, well, the Russians have stopped and we now think they may not go any further, and they're now going to open negotiations, and we're hoping to use support of other countries to in a sense, resist any further encroachment and perhaps to get them out. Well, as you know, there was a discussion in the rest of the world. The President Sarkozy of France flew to Moscow. He did a deal with the Russians, which I think was too generous to Moscow, and which anyway hasn't been fully implemented by the Russians. But nonetheless, it was indicated at the time that we were in a new kind of postmodern war in which the idea wasn't to defeat your opponents, but to, in a sense, inflict a certain blow on them, maybe only to their prestige, actually, and plausibility, and then, in a sense, pocket your winnings and walk away from the table. And that's what happened. And I wonder whether that might have influenced the expectations of people in Kiev.
Yes, I suppose that if people in Kiev think about ongoing war, they were predicting that it's going to be limited to Donbas. Because this separatists, unrecognized states of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, their territory is encompassing only the part of Donbas. So, okay, the people think that, okay, maybe Russia will try to start the offensive there to capture the whole region of Donbas. However, there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers there. This front line is well protected, so we'll make it to protect Donbas from being seized by Russian army. But I think this is also the psychological effect that when you are living, particularly in a big towns, it is very European, as I mentioned, you are in this bubble believing that nothing bad can happen, because it is absolutely unimaginable that Russians will start sending their missiles and aircraft to bombard city centers, restaurants, shopping malls, and so on. So I think that we just don't realize how fragile is the reality in which we are living. That we believe that this peaceful environment is a natural state of the world and it's not going to be demolished. And we just don't want to think that something really bad can happen. So this is, in my opinion, this is the reason why Ukrainian people didn't want to say, yes, we can be attacked from all around the border, that our big cities can be shelled or missile strike, even though American intelligence was constantly informing that this risk of invasion is extremely high. However, the surprising thing is that how fast Ukrainian people have managed to come from the state of being shocked to the state of just fighting against occupants.
The state, wouldn't you say, the state they're now in is the state of experienced partisans? They are people who are fighting a guerrilla warfare already, even though the conditions for a guerrilla warfare against an occupying power are not yet in place. They're fighting an army, both conventionally and by guerrilla tactics. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. That this collective memory of resistance is extremely important. I told you about these checkpoints. The people from villages and towns are just gathering to create these local self-defense forces, and they are also preparing like Molotov cocktails. This is something right now very common, that everyone is producing Molotov cocktails against Russian tanks. But also when I was in this front line in Donbas, in the very first hours of the invasion, I met a soldier who was just setting out from the headquarters to the front line, who was already in full armament. And he told me that right now there is only one path for Ukrainian people, and this path is to protect every inch of Ukrainian land. Because if Russia manages to occupy Ukrainian territory, the fate of Ukrainian people is going to be killed, destroyed, and exiled to Siberia. So in my opinion, this was this very deep historical experience that is also shared by Polish people. That maybe that's why it's quite easier for me to understand that, okay, if Russia comes, they are killing us or they are just exiling us to Siberia. So to avoid this fate, we just need to fight because there is no other choice. And he also told me that his son is serving in tank forces close to Chernihiv. So in these first few hours of war, father and son were protecting two different parts of Ukraine against Russian invasion. And he was absolutely sure that this is his duty. And there is no other choice. He cannot just flee from the front line, because if Russia comes, they will seize the whole territory. So there's no going to be any place to hide. And there was also this, I talked about this one soldier a day before the invasion. I was in the trench. It was like this, they call it zone 0. So this is the last trench before the separatist forces. From there, it was like 300 meters to Russians and separatist-backed Russian-backed separatists. And he told me that, of course, he appreciates that Western community provided Ukrainian forces with anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and of course he is grateful for this support. However, he knows that if Russia invades, it is going to be him and his brothers of arms, Ukrainian people, who are going to fight and die there. They are not going to be, I know, American, British, Polish, French, or Hungarian troopers deployed there. No, he didn't hold any illusion of that. He said, yeah, this is me and my colleagues that we need to fight. So from the very beginning, I think Ukrainian people realized that their fate is in their own hands.
Well, this is a very classic attitude of people fighting to get rid of a colonial yoke. The feeling that we live here, we're always going to be here. You other people, you can go away, and you will. And it also means, of course, you'll say to allies, you may help us and we're grateful, but we don't expect you. We'd like you, but we don't expect you to turn up and put on a Ukrainian uniform. Although, of course, as we both know, that is to some extent happening. There are a lot of volunteers coming, and I'd like to talk about that later. But let me just switch to the mentality and the morale of the enemies. Now, there are two ways of looking at Ukraine's enemies in this struggle. One is to focus on President Putin, and one is to focus on the Russian soldiers. And I'd like you to discuss now what they both want. I take it their views are not identical. What, first of all, is Putin thinking and doing? Because he's a modern man as well. He's lived in the West, and he's lived in Germany in the Cold War. He's been a man of the cafes, making contacts, corrupting people agreeably and slowly, but nonetheless, he knows what the modern world is like. Why didn't he realize what was likely to happen? Why was he so confident?
First of all, I suppose that he was disinformed by his own intelligence and his own environment that was trying to provide them with information that he wanted to hear. This is quite also very classical model of autocratic leaders who has lost the contact with the reality. Also, I think that I can agree with the theory that the COVID situation was quite important because, as we know, President Putin has been extremely afraid of being of getting COVID. So he was isolating from his advisors. He was staying only with a very close circle of people. Also, the information from Kremlin. There are information from Kremlin that he was spending a lot of time in Kremlin archives, scrutinizing Russian old maps and looking and learning about the Russian Empire. So he was alone with only a very small circle of people and being, let's say, immersed in this imperial mindset. dreaming about new Russian empire. So I think that the COVID might have been important, that he created this psychological environment of the leader who is immersed in the past and trying to rebuild the history, because the way in which he is acting is very against modern world. I mean, this land war, trying to capture, seize the territory, it is something from the 20th century rather, not from the 21st century way of thinking about politics and about the political gains. Yeah. But on the other hand, I am also, and I would like to underscore that I think that Putin himself is not a problem. The problem is Russian state apparatus and Russia itself, because very often I can hear in media that Putin is the one who is the source of the evil, and if we manage to remove Putin from his tenure, the Russia will behave in a different way. I'm afraid it's not. Russia is the last real colonial empire, and is thinking in this very imperial colonial way of thinking, that they can just conquer other territories and they can say neighboring nations how they should live. And that's the very big problem of Russian state, but also Russian society. Unfortunately, these public opinion polls, even though they are probably not very precise, but still they are showing that more than 50% of Russian population is in fact supporting this invasion, even if it is called a special operation in the Russian propaganda language. However, we also observed in year 2014 and 15 that the support for annexation of Crimea was extremely high. Like Russian people were, and also I was in Russia in 2016, and I heard from a lot of people, yes, we are proud that our president managed to bring Crimea Peninsula back to its homeland, to Russia. And we also think that the Eastern Ukraine should be united with Russia, because in fact this is a part of Russia, even though people there don't realize it. Yeah. We can teach them about their real identity and the real legacy, that is the legacy of Russian Empire. So I think this is the biggest threat, that Russian, not only elites, but also Russian people are thinking in this very colonial way that is so different from what we as a Western community right now are thinking and doing. And it's going to be very hard to change, because, okay, we can change Putin. Say, okay, we can try to force the Russian elites to change Putin, but to change Russian mindset is going to be extremely hard.
Let me ask you about that, because there was a period where you might argue that the Russians really were looking at their neo-imperial Great Russia mindset and perhaps thinking they would abandon it or break free of it. I think that was the period of the first decade after 1991. You did have Soviet officials at high levels who were thinking along those terms. There was a sense that perhaps Russia had been one of the victors of the Cold War by breaking free from communism, and that it could join in the institutions, the Euro-Atlantic institutions of the West. In fact, Yeltsin tried on several occasions to argue that point, and Putin did himself say this as well. Now, was that ever, in your view, a practical possibility? And if it was, did we in the West make a huge mistake in not, so to speak, wooing Russia more effectively?
Yeah, I suppose that the first problem was that in the 90s, that it was this very huge, very short period of real freedom in Russia, but it occurred that this freedom without institution building occurred to be rather a mafia. It was rather a mafia creating environment, and the Russian people really felt humiliated. But what happened to them? The poverty, the loss of sense, also this huge amount of corruption, and hundreds of thousands or a million people were just left alone with any roadmap how to develop this country. So they were left alone. But when the Putin came, also I think the Western community believed that he's going to be the one who will build a modern Russian state, modern in terms of Western standards, that he was going to fight with corruption, with oligarchs, with mafia, and that he was going to start this institution building process. And I think also Western community just neglected the fact that he is a former KGB officer and that his mindset is a totalitarian one. And in fact, in the year, I'm not sure, it was 2008, during the security conference in Munich, when he said that this solution, I think it was 2008, okay, around this solution of Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of 20th century. So he actually very openly said that his political aim is to reverse this process and to rebuild, not maybe Soviet, but Russian Empire. But also the Western community didn't seem to be very concerned about his words. I mean that it was very hard to believe that he's not just saying this. It's not only the part of his political PR. That it is that he's really said what he thinks.
Yes.
And he's pursuing this policy since that time.
He always, it seems to me, he regularly says what he thinks. I mean, it's not only on that occasion, but again and again, he's maintained that he wants to, as you say, reverse the result of the Cold War in a new European security architecture, which might have been done by agreement if we had managed somehow to agree to bring Russia in more speedily into a relationship with NATO. The problem being there, of course, that the new members of NATO joined NATO precisely in order to defend themselves against Russia. And from their standpoint, that would have been inviting the fox into the hen house. So I think there are problems there. But I think that we are right to look at Putin as well as with the Russian people, because if you are correct in saying that the problem is the Russian people who are the construct of Russia as a state, which strongly influences the opinions of its people, and they are influenced to become the supporters of a neo-imperial state that incorporates other significant ethnic minorities, but all in a structure of imperial power. Then he himself is one of the most determined believers in this, and the one who takes it most seriously, who studies it, who produces arguments which he then sends to the rest of the world. And as yet, let me argue a case here for him. Has he been given a proper answer? Has there been the kind of sustained answer to his statements about the Soviet Union on the one hand, but also about the Second World War and the origins of that, and including the Nazi-Soviet pact? That was the major statement. Have we in the West, in a sense, gone out to make intellectual combat rather than to find ourselves facing physical combat in this war?
I think, because this is very interesting, your remark, that actually the West didn't manage to present Russians with alternative to this imperial narrative. So we're trying to persuade Russian people that, of course, if they manage to implement the rules and regulations, let's say, of liberal economics, but also human rights and so on, their country is going to change profoundly, and they will manage somehow to achieve at least partially the living standard of people in the West, and they are going to be joyful because they are becoming the part of the Western community of nations, even though the global community of nations. But the problem is that I suppose that Russians, or at least Russian elite, don't want to be the part of Western community as on the same level as other states. They always claim that Russia is a bit different, that it has some kind of privileged place in the both history of a mankind, but also on this geopolitical scene. As the US has its privileged position because it is a superpower. Yeah. So Russia also is a superpower, so we cannot be just at the same level as, I don't know, Poland, even France, Germany, or Italy. So we need to pursue this special status. And I think we didn't manage to convince Russians that in fact they can take advantage of being within Western community but without the special status. And what is Russia trying to do right now is trying to regain this special status. However, I think that Russian people will have to confront with the reality after, when this war is finished, that in fact Russia committed crimes against humanity. Yes. And war crimes, and it's going to be extremely hard because a very important part of Russian identity and also current Russian historical propaganda is that, of course, Russians managed to defeat Nazi Germany. Also, that there were millions of victims of Nazi invasion. That is true, of course, because there were millions of Russians who were killed, decimated, and of course they were also, Russian people were also the victims of the Second World War. Of course, it's something obvious. It is also interesting that when I was in Ukraine, I talked to the people who told me that in fact they are right now protecting Ukraine because their grandfathers were fighting with Nazis in Soviet army. So that is the reason why right now Ukrainians are fighting against Russians. So this collective memory is important. But Russians were always victims. That was true. And right now they are going to confront the situation where they are perpetrators of war crimes.